You may recall that when Rachel introduced you, she talked about your renowned leadership style, and that clearly has been something that has really driven your career and a lot of the successes at Home Depot. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your management and leadership style.
So the first thing is I'm not sure I think of something as my style. That's an interesting thought. What I would say is that there are a lot of people that I've learned things from in terms of leadership that I try to incorporate. The first is I have, as you referenced, I've had the opportunity to work for a lot of extraordinary leaders and learn a little something different from each one of them. Some in politics, some in business. I worked for George Bush father when he was vice president, actually not when he was president. And one of the things I learned from him was every day, so you got to picture in your mind the vice president's staff is a very small staff. It's no one cares, right? It's a fundamentally irrelevant, difficult office. And it was interesting watching him because what he would do every day, at the start of every day, he would come in and he would spend an hour, and at the time, this is back in 1980s, he would be on his typewriter and he would type out notes. And he'd spend an hour a day typing out notes to people. And when, as a member of his staff, you got a note from the Vice President of the United States that noticed something you did, recognized you for something, you just walked on air for a while. And he sent these far and wide. And later in my career, when I was selling power plants in Indonesia, I actually was talking to a guy, and he pulls me aside and he says, "Now, you're going to win this project." And I said, "That's great. We got the best product, best price." He said, "No, you're going to win this project because I saw that you worked for Vice President Bush. And when I was a lowly deputy to the something in the Indonesian UN mission, I got a note from him, and we corresponded from then on, and he's an amazing man, and you're part of the family." And you go, what you learn from a leadership perspective is how much we all thrive on recognition, and how the time you take to recognize people for what they do is one of the most important things you can do in the job, and it's something I try to do at Home Depot.
My question is, you talked about store experience, and I work retail, and I know that different chain stores around the country have different store experiences, but how do you make sure that each store is providing that same experience that the company values?
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously an enormous challenge with over 2,000 stores. So one of the things that we've done over the last few years is we have something that we call power hours in our store. And during power hours, which typically are from 10 to 2 in a weekday and then all weekend, our expectation of associates is that they do nothing but customer service. And if you think about a Home Depot, which is 100,000 plus square feet with 30,000 plus different units, SKUs in the store, there's a lot of tasking that goes on. And in fact, it's about 50-50 hours that our associates spend tasking versus customer facing. The important thing that we did was to say, during this period of time, don't task. And the reason we did that is kind of for exactly what your question suggests, which is if you leave that to every associate to make that call, that's my complexity down rather than simplicity. It's got to be that every associate on the floor of our store knows what we expect of him or her. And that very clear statement of those hours are only about customer service has actually been, I think, a big plus for us in a number of respects. I will say at the start, actually, most of our associates didn't think we'd stick to it. So they all thought, well, that's interesting, but you're going to be telling us to task because that's just going to be impossible for us to do. We've been doing it for a couple of years now, while we're not 100%. I think it's made a real difference.
My question is, in a large firm like Home Depot, how do you keep it entrepreneurial?
Yeah, so the first response to that is an ongoing struggle that we don't always succeed in. I'm fond of saying, the challenge with any large business, there's a great chart on this from Jim Collins' Good to Great book that shows just a simple four-blocker. And on the x-axis is entrepreneurial spirit, and on the y-axis is discipline. And what you see is, if you can imagine this little four-blocker, if you see out on the high entrepreneurial spirit, no discipline, tend to be your startups. As you move to the left, or lesser entrepreneurial spirit, if you have no entrepreneurial spirit, no discipline, you're a bureaucracy. I mean, my personal view is you're the government. If you get no entrepreneurial spirit but high discipline, you're a hierarchical corporate structure, which is pretty easy to drift into. The great companies are always on the upper right side, which is high entrepreneurial spirit and high discipline. That balance, you never get it right one time and walk away. It is a constant fight, and we like, in Home Depot, we like to talk about our ditch to ditch. We do that ditch to ditch a lot. We'll veer rapidly over to entrepreneurial, and it will unspool, and we'll go, whoa, and then we'll go all the way to the other side of the ditch, and we'll get very disciplined. I would say that's the single biggest challenge and the single thing we work the hardest at, is to maintain that balance both in the stores and in our store support center.
Thanks for coming. What do you feel so passionate about that when you're engaged in it, you're really energized? And how much of a percent of your time do you get to engage in it?
So I will tell you some of the things that are the most fun in this job. Probably the most fun thing is, and we got our head of HR, Tim Crow, is here in the audience. And when we go around to cities and towns across the country, we have dinners with our hourly associates. And if you notice in our stores, our hourly associates win badges for customer service. And then if you get to a certain level, you're a platinum badge winner. And every time we go into town, we have dinner with our platinum badge winners. And that is the single best thing. That's the single best thing to do, because first off, I take one step back and go. 4 years ago, when I got this job, I was referencing our store managers meeting. I asked our founder, Bernie Marcus, to come back and talk to our store managers, and he hadn't been back in a while, and grown men were crying and cheering and everything. It was a big event. And it was interesting, the first thing that he talked about, because the first thing he really emphasized was, and I would have gotten it wrong because I would have probably said customer service, but the first thing he talked about was the Home Depot as a source of wealth creation for its associates. And the important thing about these dinners, the important thing about the company, is we are a place where people can come in to work from any walk of life. And if they're willing to work hard and apply themselves, they can succeed and make a great professional career for themselves and a great advancement personally. And you see these stories literally every time we do these dinners. I could just, there's a lot of passion. So last week I was in Canada with a group of store managers, and it's just this great story of one of the store managers who started out as a lot attendant in the store. And his store manager brought him in, and he was just great telling the story. I'm not going to do it justice. The store manager brings him in, and he says, son, you got two choices. You can leave, I can fire you, or you're going to go to another store and take a demotion. But those are your two choices. And the guy goes, this was an unbelievable wake-up call for me. It wasn't what I expected. My wife had just given birth. It was traumatic. And I said, okay, I'm going to take a risk. I'll take the demotion and go to the other store. He's now running the store that he got kicked out of. And that sense of, wow, what you can do, again, just with hard work and a lot of dedication, is what makes it's what makes the 300,000, the experience of the 300,000 associates so great. And that's the passion of the business. The passion of the business is seeing people come in and succeed. I'd say every one of our division presidents, I think, started out as an hourly associate in the Home Depot. And you love seeing those development opportunities within the company.
Hi, a lot of us when we graduate will be taking more of the entry-level positions, and I was wondering if you had any suggestions of how we can practice or exhibit leadership skills or hone those leadership skills when we don't have a formal leadership position.
Yeah, that's a great question, and here would be a way to think about it. Again, one of the good things about getting this job is people gave me tons of advice, and some of it's actually really good advice, so I can pass it on. So somebody said after I got the job, they said, you really have to think about leadership in 3 different dimensions. And most people think about leadership as the people who report to them. And they think, I lead the people who work for me. And you kind of get that. Certainly that's what I was thinking about. I lead this organization. So no, actually, leadership is across 3 different dimensions. You lead the people that report to you, but you lead your peers, and you need to be intentional about how you lead your peers, because it's important to be able to lead your peers. And you go, okay, I kind of get that. That's an interesting thought. The third one, though, was the one I really hadn't thought about, which said, you lead your boss. You lead your boss. Now, you don't tend to think about that, but it was worthwhile for me thinking about, because I've got 8 bosses, so how do you lead them? I've got a couple of people here from my staff who lead me very effectively, and it is a skill. What you'd say is, look, some people you can go in and say, you're a moron, change your mind, and other people, if you did that, you're out of a job. So you got to go, what works with this person? You actually have to think about, how do I get this person to do what you're going to know your job better than your boss does. Just start there. After 2 weeks, you're going to know your job better than your boss, right? And your boss is going to tell you to do things that you're going to go bone dumb, doesn't make any sense, don't want to do it. And you've got to figure out, your job is figuring out how you communicate that and how you get your boss going in a more positive direction. And what I'd say is, it sounds interesting and easy. That's tough. And it is leadership. So what I would say is, think intentionally about that. When you're driving home at night and you get some spare time, say, who is this person that I'm working for? And how do I influence him or her? What's that influence? Because he or she doesn't want to do stupid things. They're just, they just don't know the job as well as you do.
Hi, Avi Leibovich, second year MBA. Have you found that servant leadership works in industry?
Yeah, so look, whatever you call it, servant leadership, I believe deeply that at Home Depot, we call it our inverted pyramid, where the CEO's at the bottom and the associates closest to the customer are close to the top, and the customer's at the top. It is a profound statement of how businesses should work. And so this is great, because I'm just replaying for you all the advice that I got when I got this job. So I'll give you another great piece of advice that I got that was a great visual piece of advice. And actually somebody who does a very good job leading me in the office told me this as well. So I thought when I got this job that my job was about making decisions. I'm the boss, and the more decisions I make, the happier everybody is. Pretty quickly found out, no. Don't be doing that. And think about the organization. If you think about the pyramid, think about it as a whole set of interlocking gears. You know, you're going all the way down until you get to the associates on the floor. Said, if you think of your job as, I'm going to spin this top gear as much as I can, make great decisions, and on and on and on, the rest of the organization is going to be spinning out of control. Because a little torque there equals massive torque through the rest of the organization. So you actually have to be much more gradual and much more focused than you think. And they said, more importantly, your job is, how does the gear at the bottom that is actually interacting with your customer, how does the gear at the bottom spin so it impacts you? That's the equation to solve. That's why we talk about the inverted pyramid, because in the end, at the end, if you don't structure it so that the organization is responsive to what the customers are looking for, you don't succeed. And there is no way, there's just no way for me to begin to replicate the knowledge of 300,000 associates in terms of their daily interaction. So the structure of the business, again, I think the founders a very profound organizational principle that you have to think about an inverted pyramid as you lead, which is another way of phrasing servant leadership, which is my job is figuring out how I solve the problems of 4,000, 300,000 people that are close to the customers, because they're the ones fixing the customer's problems.
How much input do you get from your board of directors, and how much do you listen to them?
Is that a trick question?
No.
Just fine,
And what do you do when you don't feel like some of the directors are carrying their weight? And also, how do you personally evaluate them as representing the shareholders?
It's a great question. First, we have a terrific board at the Home Depot, and it's a fairly small board. So we only have 8 external board members, and with myself, which for a company of our size is actually quite a small board. It is a very, I think our whole board is very proud of the board. It's a very active board because it's so small. You know, kind of everybody is around every issue. We ask our board members every quarter to walk stores with our management team, so they get both direct involvement with our management team and a lot of in-store experience. And you know, we have extensive committees, and you know, our board is very actively involved. So I don't have the hypothetical of, you know, what would you do if your board wasn't adding a lot of value, because our board does add a lot of value. And their suggestions are great suggestions. I'd also say that very fortunate to have board members who understand the role of the board. So the biggest thing they do for me is they'll lift my head up from the plow. So, you know, it's kind of day to day. You know, maybe if I'm really thinking long term, I'm thinking 3 quarters, and they're asking the questions of 3 years. They're asking where are you going to be in 7 years? That's an enormous value. And I think from a shareholder perspective, again, our board and particularly our lead director, Bonnie Hill, spends a lot of time with outside shareholders, with our shareholders, talking to them about what their concerns are, so that you know, their issues are pretty well reflected in the board discussions.